Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This is broadcast number 552, and it's July the 5th, 1982. I asked you last week if you would contribute to membership to Kazoo. This is a listener-sponsored station. It's not commercial radio, and membership is $15 yearly, $10 if you're a senior or student, and a contribution of much more if you care to contribute to the station. We take a lot for granted every day, and I think that the outrage that was expressed at the possibility that I wasn't even going to be on the air was so overwhelming, with literally hundreds of calls for 10 days. So I would assume that some of you would show your appreciation to KAZU and send a check as soon as possible. Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 93950. You can telephone a pledge, but send a letter. That's better. And another matter I want to bring up, that I offered my time at the suggestion of people at the station to have an afternoon, a Sunday afternoon, to answer questions. Many of you have questions on your mind, and I do answer the telephone and take calls, but week after week I throw out a lot of controversial information which is necessarily related to programs I did in the past, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. I'm constantly updating, and you catch it with the new news breaking and don't remember or didn't listen way back to get some of these connections. And while I'm giving these current news events, I don't always make the necessary connections to events that took place in the past. So on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock at MPC at the Music Hall, for several hours we'll get together and I'll answer any questions you have, starting with your third question. And we'll go from there and see what it is you're interested in and what particular subjects and what that I've talked about on the program interests you particularly. The first question always is, why don't the Kennedys do anything about the assassinations? The second is, how come you're still alive? So I always start with the third question. And we'll spend a Sunday afternoon. That'll be at MPC July 18th at 4 o'clock. And $5 will be the cost of admittance, and the money will go to KAZU. This will be on the tapes, even though these tapes go out of the city and to other states in the United States and out of the country. I still think it's pertinent for you to know what we're doing and that we must give back and share what we have with the station, and I hope you will do that. Now, this week there were 4 suggestions this past week and a half of military coups, and I have a list of earlier coups attempted since Ronald Reagan was President of the United States. He's escalating the military intelligence, the CIA, the counterintelligence. So it's terribly important to watch the coups of the week or the past week and a half, and I haven't updated them. There was an attempted military coup that was squashed in Tehran, and of course we would like to get rid of Khomeini, and this was put down this past week. There was a murder, a alleged suicide. A gun went off for the president of the Dominican Republic. A new president is supposed to come in very shortly, but this one's gun just went over and hit him in the head when it fell on the floor, and he was the first president of the whole Caribbean to have been elected. A new successor is coming in. He was supposed to have come in of his own free will, and he went out flat on the floor in a coffin. Another attempt last week in Zimbabwe was Mugabe, who escaped assassination attempt. And, of course, the United States and South Africa have been trying to get a poke at him for a long time. And in Guatemala, the president is threatened all the time with a coup there. Mr. Mont, M-O-N-T-T, the president, a devout Christian from California who's running Guatemala, feels that the military may even come in and somebody's farther right than him. So those were 4 just this past week and a half, and we'll update those about every 2 weeks. Now, the reason the coups are so important, terribly important, is that a lot of the problems going on in Washington right now between Alexander Haig and George Bush and Ronald Reagan are problems going back to attempted coups that have taken place since the President of the United States was inaugurated last year, a year and a half ago. The coup between George Bush and Alexander Haig when Ronald Reagan was supposed to die in March of '81. The mistake of having the Pope survive 2 assassination attempts, and this goes back to the CIA and Edwin Wilson in New York, who's safely in New York, and various agents of Navy intelligence and the CIA. The planned coup in Spain for the fascist dictatorship to get rid of the royal family and put in a Franco type of military dictatorship, which boomeranged and caused a lot of anxiety over the heads of the United States intelligence again, and then the murder of Sadat with Mubarak and Alexander Haig and George Bush. A lot of the turmoil and the dancing around of the heads of states right now fighting each other, I believe, has to do with control of the agencies after the goofs in Spain, in the Vatican, in the United States, and in Egypt. And many of the people involved in those attempted coups are speaking, wanting clemency, leaking out pieces of information. And the excuses for the dumping of Haig at this time and for the Bush people taking over has more to do with controlling what information comes out because of the failure of these particular attempts to put in fascist states not coming off the way it was planned originally. And there's a lot of leaking of information, and I've talked about these events in detail, but right now the characters are having problems with each other. Now, last week or several weeks ago, June 21st, I mentioned with Edwin Wilson home that he made deals to sacrifice several Chilean who were involved with the murder of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett. Edwin Wilson came home with his $18 million that he picked up in Zurich. And one of the things I mentioned that he would be willing to set up Arafat and Gaddafi in exchange for his immunity. He's been saying, and Jack Anderson's been writing, that Edwin Wilson worked for the CIA and for Navy intelligence while he was overseas, arming the so-called leftist terrorists, always funded by the CIA. The news this morning said that Gaddafi is urging the PLO to commit suicide. I guess he would be next when they go into Libya, then he'll commit suicide. But I saw a movie several years ago of Idi Amin with the suicide kamikaze troops trained again by the Central Intelligence Agency. So if they got into trouble or were apprehended, they would kill themselves off. So it's interesting that Gaddafi, who's a big mouth who was going to do so much if anybody touched his country, is not sending in troops or airplanes or helping Arafat at all. He's telling them to commit suicide, which is pretty brave for him. And one of the problems that I mentioned several weeks ago is that in exchange for Edwin Wilson being home and getting off of charges, a la the Hinkley case, a similar kind of deal he's making, he's willing to sacrifice the people that he's armed to the hilt because the game of the left-right terrorism has to be over. The CIA simply cannot fund what is supposed to be all these leftists going around the globe killing various persons in different countries because every time they leave a piece of information, it always goes back to the CIA and Navy intelligence. And with the scandals of the Munich Olympic Games being organized and funded by the CIA and not by the Arabs, and the killing of Jewish officials in London and Paris and American officials in those countries also linked to the same teams in the terrorist school set up in Libya by the intelligence community and in Uganda and the torture equipment. Just that area alone, I'm not talking about South America or Central America. The time has come to halt some of that madness, and because Israel has so much information that the United States has been behind this, and many other countries, that every country sits back and watches Israel displace 1 million people or kill 12,000 and decimate the place and put Lebanon down to rubble, and nobody is raising a finger. Russia said this week they wouldn't do anything. Gaddafi won't do anything. Arafat, it seems, has no friends, and he's betrayed. The name of the game is loner. You go into this thing for what you can get out of it, and if you're up against the wall, you're on your own. The CIA has the same system. They have suicide kits that they're supposed to take in case they're captured, and you take the game for as far as you can. Therefore, the loyal friend of Arafat, Mr. Gaddafi, is saying, why don't you die? Commit suicide. I knew that the intent now was to surround Arafat and Gaddafi because there's too much coming out. Speaking of coming out, in this morning's San Francisco Chronicle and the New York Times, a large article, "The Green Beret Unfolds Their Secret Life." Now, I said that when Frank Turple and George Corcola were arrested in December 1979, that this was one of the most important stories of my years of research. I'd done 9 years up to that time, 9 years on the air, that these men are behind the whole era, going back, Corcola, to the John Kennedy assassination, to the murders of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Che Guevara, Malcolm X, Death Incorporated. If you take Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, and George Corcola, or Gary Corcola. Well, the article this morning is by Philip Taubman in the New York Times, and in essence, this is what he's saying, in case you don't have this story. Luke Thompson is a man that worked with the Green Berets and U.S. Army intelligence, and he is speaking. And if you multiply the hundreds of people who have information, or even 20 or 30, they could really open up this whole era if they go properly to be investigated. Luke Thompson tells how he worked for military intelligence, and that the Green Berets and the military intelligence ran the U.S. foreign policy on a secret basis from 1962 to 1978. 62 was the year before John Kennedy was murdered, when Theodore Shackley came over from Germany, and Edwin Wilson and Helmut Streicher and various people from Hitler's Gestapo and Franco's regime organized the special forces for death squads to decimate and kill people all over the world. The New York Times story today is how these teams were set up from 1962 to 78, how they were a part of the U.S. foreign policy, which I have said on the air for years was happening. Mr. Thompson was recruited when he was 14 years old into the National Guard. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was recruited with David Ferry into the Civil Air Patrol when he was just a teenager, 16 years old. Hitler used young men when they were 14 or 15. He pulled them into the Battle of Malmedy so they could later join the United States forces. Mr. Luke Thompson started when he was 14 years old and was admitted to the Green Forces Special Training in 1959 as a kid. And he worked with the CIA. Now he tells how he went to Southeast Asia and how he was set up that the Special Forces, U.S. Army Intelligence, is nothing but a killing team, how they're trained to kill. He tells about attempted murders in Dominican Republic, another country where we had our covert action and CIA overthrow. He tells about killing Che Guevara, how they set up the murder of Che Guevara, the United States, and I could list, if we have time later, 40 countries where this has happened by the CIA and the Special Forces. He tells about his trips to Thailand and Laos and Cambodia, Vietnam, how he killed the first person and what it was like. He was on a special trip with him, and he just had to do it. He had orders. He says it's just as simple. It's just like brushing your teeth. It has to be done. He didn't dwell on the assassination of these people at all. In 1977, he sent to military intelligence to the Defense Department. He meets Edwin Wilson in Zurich, and his role then is to go to Libya to train terrorists, where they have a school for training. The United States military intelligence, with the Central Intelligence Agency, set up schools for making ammunition, for blowing up airplanes. And this is quite a long article about the explosives and how he worked for the Special Forces. And by June 1978, there was so much evidence coming out that these men worked for Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, and the CIA. They are the extension of our foreign policy. And the important thing is that there are training schools in Florida and Alabama and Colorado, in Texas and Mississippi for us. They don't just go over and kill. And as I said over and over, if you see the movie Missing and you look at what happened in Chile, put yourself in the United States 5 years from now. These people are funded with your tax dollars. They're trained to kill. The Special Forces was set up in 1952. What they did in Southeast Asia is to begin the heroin and the cocaine, the narcotics market in the Middle East, the hashish and the opium and so forth coming in from Southeast Asia and the Middle East, the flooding of narcotics, and with the profit of that to buy weapons for people that had worked with Nazis from Germany who came over here and trained and set up our special forces for breaking up countries, for breaking up organizations, for killing particular political leaders, trying to kill Fidel Castro many times. But not only he mentions Che Guevara, they got Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy. These people have been working a long time. And now, because Mr. Luke Thompson is talking about this, and Edwin Wilson is home, and Congress is supposed to be looking into this, if they were to follow this story, and I've said it many, many times, if they follow the story, they'll go right back to Dallas, Texas, when John Kennedy was murdered in 1963. There was another article this week on my favorite subject. You may have seen it on the newsstands, the National Examiner. Front page story, Adolf Hitler is alive. His master plan to foment chaos around the world. This has been one of my favorite subjects, and I call the Examiner. It's run by the Globe, and I've done many articles for them. Years ago, I did a lot of articles, and I called them this week about doing some more on the Hitler-Falkland story. Now, their source of information allegedly is a couple of psychics, but they are very well groomed into the information that's available about the Nazis in Argentina. And this article goes extensively into the fact of Joseph Mengele being with Adolf Hitler. They don't cite their documentation. If you want my programs on Hitler, Argentina, and the Falklands starting April the 11th, that was several months ago, the program 540, I did one on Alexander Haig, the Falklands, and the UFO, the Nazi secret weapons, with the source of books, one book in particular, the UFO Nazi secret weapons, the role of Admiral Byrd and James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, and our role building up Antarctica for World War III. Another good book I mentioned was Assault on Eternity by Leslie Rose, a new book on the military bases down there with the Nazis beginning and wanting World War III. Another reference I had on that series of tapes was Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallée, who now works for Bechtel Corporation and for Mr. George Shultz, who's now our Secretary of State. The Crime and Punishment of I.G. Farben. And there are many good articles in National Geographic, and I have the references here. The Police Gazette, January 1977, an entire issue, 60 pages on Hitler's escape route and how he got there. It used to be very funny to talk about this subject and cite books and chapters and so forth, but it's getting less hilarious, and while this tabloid doesn't have their sources, when you talk to the people down there, their offices in Florida now, they're not in Montreal anymore, they have plenty of savvy and they have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And they put it in general terms, but they want to break the shock value of what if he is there, or how would you handle it? And if you're standing in line at the Safeway and you're buying your groceries and peaches and you see Hitler's alive, will you do anything? And if you're told that that was Hitler in Switzerland or Argentina, how would you care? So the news is seeping out. It isn't documented, their story, but there's enough to document the fact that nobody ever had any bit of proof that Hitler died in the bunker, and there's a lot of proof by the dental charts and the very dentists who lied that Eva Braun didn't die there. And I've done many hours on the air about this subject. Another good article that I will do in detail in a few weeks, if I have the time, it's called Today the Falklands, Tomorrow, Are the Southern Cone Nazis Planning Slave Labor in Antarctica? And that's one of the subjects I've brought up on the air for many, many weeks, is the use of Antarctica for batch consignments, for space stations, for mass migration, a continent as large as the United States plus Mexico that is 100% military. You can only go there and visit through military identification, and Antarctica is very, very controlled. It's harder to get there than into any single prison or institution in the world. Antarctica is a total military base. And this article came out in a newspaper in New York called Overthrow, and they've got the map of the Nazi bases in Antarctica, the Nazi threat to world peace, and quotations from the National Geographic, and the role of the Nazis in Brazil and Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile since 1945, how the Third Reich has set up headquarters for a long time down there. It's a long, detailed article, and I will update and share some of this with you in case you can't get the magazine Overthrow. And if you write to me or call, I'll give you the address of where you can send for it. You can call New York. The area code's 212-533-5028 and ask for the July 1982 issue on Antarctica slave labor and Nazis down there. So that seeing that article on the newsstand in the Examiner reminded me that there is a lot of current material in addition to what I'm doing on the programs that is available for you that is coming out now. Also in the Examiner, there was a story on the front page and inside, Watergate conspirator Ehrlichman tells how I plotted Nixon's death. Now, he's telling how after the Watergate crisis came together and they were on Air Force One, that he planned to go in where the pilot was and fall between him and the switch and maybe end all of their problems. But as I mentioned, June 14th, on an anniversary program of Watergate, just several weeks ago, the Lewis Tackwood allegations were that John Ehrlichman and the plumbers and E. Howard Hunt were planning to kill Richard Nixon at the time of the conventions to make Spiro Agnew president. It's interesting that 10 years later, he's telling you of his plans to kill the president, But as yet, the established media and various newspapers will not research, because it is available. The facts are available of Squad 19 of the Los Angeles Police Department, the plans to kill Richard Nixon in San Diego, and then when the convention was moved to do it in Miami. By then, the money that was linked to the Watergate people would be linked to the Nixon assassination, so they couldn't kill Richard Nixon. But that was the original plan. It was to get him out of the way, round up the radicals, blame the radicals for it, and make Spiro Agnew President of the United States. The same Los Angeles Police Department that was arranging Squad 19 with the CIA, with the FBI in Washington, D.C., and with people inside the White House, is the police department now who's being called to task because of the John Belushi murder. Several articles in the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, one an editorial, "The Belushi death, the move to open a closed case is long overdue." I mentioned last week when I came on the air that the news account on the radio said that they were going to open up the case. The editorial, of all things, I don't know why they have to wait until an article comes out in the National Enquirer for people in Los Angeles to be able to even analyze or figure out that John Belushi's death was a cold-blooded murder with the assistance of the Los Angeles Police Department. Now the editorial in the Examiner says from the very beginning it was obvious that the Los Angeles Police Department's investigation into the death of comedian John Belushi was flawed. Well, it's only obvious to me. I don't know of any other person in any news media that suggested he was murdered. They said first there was the police report that they received that he died of natural causes. Then it seems there was a drug overdose. And then Kathleen Evelyn Smith was with him and left the bungalow, and there were other people with him who were never contacted by the police just before he died. And the editorial goes into some of the facts, and one of the policemen in Los Angeles, Lieutenant Jim McMurray, simply saying in quotes, "It's just another fat junkie belly up," and letting those people involved in whoever supplied the drugs, who shot him, walking away without even a single question, even though this particular woman was on probation and could have been pulled in. She was allowed to bring the drug paraphernalia, spread it around the room, bring back a spoon and say that this is what he wanted, and she gave him what he wanted. Another article in the Herald-Examiner last week, Belushi probe reopens with a list of clues. Those of you who listen to this broadcast know that I had clues all over the place when he died. Now they say they want interviews with at least 6 people, including 2 celebrities. That's Robin Williams and De Niro. De Niro was in Taxi, the one that influenced John Hinkley, interesting enough. Miss Smith is now vacationing in Canada. That's where she had her broken ribs on the way up there and almost died. The hotel employees are being questioned, and the LAPD now are going into the evidence of where she was, where she got the drugs, did he know they were mixed, and why was he injected like 24 times, and he was dead, and she goes out and gets some coffee and makes some bets on horses and so forth. Another front page story down in L.A., the DA wants new Belushi investigation. The truth is that the police department had the statistics on him, on the enlarged brain, on the physical condition of this man. I said at the time he would have to be poisoned. He had fresh needle marks. There was no evidence of scars before that he had these shots. That his heart, I mentioned this was back in March of this year, that his heart was 460 grams. A normal heart is usually 300 to 350, that his brain was 30% too large. The brain had just instantly blown up. His spleen was swollen 3 times the normal size. He was afraid he was going to die. She didn't call any person. And the first accounts were that he never shot heroin. He never, there were no stories about his being a Hollywood junkie all over the place. His wife said that he hated needles and couldn't stand having needles. He was supposed to appear at the Academy Awards the next week and give presentations at the Academy Award. When they first had the body, they couldn't find any scars or needles. They thought maybe it was a heart attack. There were all these discrepancies about choking on food, and I mentioned it was probably like the Mama Cass or Jimi Hendrix vomit, the poisoning in the food. They thought he had choked on food. The autopsy yielded no cause of death. 4 days later, The newspapers had no cause of death. The coroner said we have to do more tests, and they sent parts of the body to be checked out, and then they thought he had a heart attack. And then later, ABC TV says he was a drug addict, and then all of a sudden, after they look at the body, they can't see 24 needles, that she injected in that one morning. The police had her. They let her go. They sent her on her way to Canada. They didn't want to touch the case. They wanted him dead, and I know why they want him dead. As I said before, the FBI doesn't appreciate him making movies about them dealing drugs down in Florida. I will do more on George Shultz in a little while, but these stories are important because they're the same Los Angeles policemen who covered up the murder of Robert Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, that made Richard Nixon president, that brought us the whole Watergate problems to begin with, Crook Nixon in office. The LAPD has worked close with Ronald Reagan and Paul Laxalt and Bobby Hall and the drug dealers, killing musicians and artists and drugging Howard Hughes and taking over the empire to really make the Nazification of America, to set up the assassination teams with Robert Mayhew. There was no Hughes after 1966. He was never seen. But the LAPD and the Beverly Hills Police Department have done this to countless stars, to politicians, to public figures, inventors, and scientists like Howard Hughes. Belushi isn't the first, and he's not the last, but someday they're going to have to come to task. The Sheriff's Department, Peter Pitchess, had set up the Manson family, the Sharon Tate murders. All of these I've done for years. So now, finally, they're being called to task on the John Belushi. If any one of these cases were opened up properly, and I'm sure they won't be, we would find out who's killed a lot more people than you think were natural deaths. You think they overdosed because they lived it high and liked the drugs. Knowing that they like drugs, you can give them drugs that are poison, such as Lenny Bruce, who was very political. The fact that he took heroin doesn't mean that everyone on heroin dies. The country and the world is filled with it. But when you get a political figure and he takes it, you give him a double whammy and then cremate the body, and you don't know what dose is even in him. It's not a normal dose. I'm going to take a break in about 30 seconds, and then we're going to get back onto some more of these other cases, and I hope some more. I'll get back to Bechtel Corporation and George Shultz, our new Secretary of State. It's July the 5th, 1982. That's a lot of twos. Just a few comments about the John Hinkley case, because many of you are reading a lot of articles on the subject. The New York Times had a front page story about the Hinkley defense. It says the John Hinkley defense cost the federal government $311,855. That's not the $750,000 for John Hinkley just to incarcerate him at a military base, such as the Marine base of the federal prison. The psychiatrist sent a bill of $311,855 just for the private psychiatrist who was supposed to prove that he was sane, right? And Dr. Paul Dietz, an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard, who coordinated the team, the weak prosecution to make sure that John Hinkley got off, he only got $115,917, that bloke. Okay. Now, the defense for, we won't even talk about the psychiatrist defense because the Hinkley spent their money, but the prosecution, in order to get him out free on the streets in 50 days, it cost the taxpayers about $500,000 for this one person, and he's laughing right now, giving interviews and laughing. Just in comparison, Artie Bremer shot George Wallace and 3 other people. This is a presidential candidate and 3 people. Hinkley shot the president and 3 people. In 1972, George Wallace was shot. The standard fee for the state to do the psychiatric evidence on Artie Bremer was $1,000. Some of the doctors did it for free, and Dr. Jonas Rappaport of Baltimore didn't charge the government anything. He worked for free on the Bremer trial and charged us $106,751 for letting Hinkley off. That's our psychiatrist for the prosecution, okay? And the Washington Post had an article. 3 Hinkley jurors had relatives in mental hospitals. 3 of them had relatives who were mentally sick, who were locked up in mental hospitals. A 4th juror has an older sister who was treated for a nervous breakdown, and a 5th juror was under psychiatric treatment herself due to a car accident a few years ago. So that was 5 people, and that seems to be a little overload or sympathy for somebody with mental problems. The jury was stacked with 5 people, and that's an awful lot of people. And, of course, the sympathy went to his state of mind. And Mr. Hinkley, John Hinkley, of course, is giving interviews. I don't feel sorry for Reagan. I shot him, and his polls went up. Now, I'm going to do the rest of this half hour on a continuation of some very complicated subjects that I've been doing the last 3 weeks, basically called The Travelers. And this has to do with the attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan, the conflict of George Bush with Alexander Haig, the conflict of Alexander Haig with the Italian P2 scandal that's coming down. Richard Nixon and both Ronald Reagan accepted a lot of money for their campaigns from Licio Gelli, who's now in Argentina, Michael Sindona, who's now in jail, all linked to missing money in Italy. And as I said last week and the week before, when the conference was going on in Bonn, when Ronald Reagan had his first trip to Europe, and he's trying to be the great host and show how erudite he is, he's at Versailles, he's at Windsor Castle. While all this is going on, I mentioned that Roberto Calvi's body was found dangling off a bridge in London. And there were 2 articles in the newspaper that I read this last week that are very important to what was going on and what is going on to Europe now, in Europe at the present time. Now, Alexander Haig is directly linked to these particular people, and the scandal in Italy, to the Pope shooting, to the military attempt of the coup in Spain last year, to the murder of Sadat in Egypt, and so is George Bush. He was entertaining Mubarak the day before he went back to Egypt when Sadat was shot. George Bush has worked with Edwin Wilson's team, that Task Force 157, as director of the CIA. So these 2 men are vying for a certain amount of power in the White House because the scandals that encircle them are breaking out in various newspapers around the country. And unfortunately, I know on the West Coast there hasn't been a thing about the material I'm going to share with you. One article is from the Houston Post and one is from the Washington Post. I take 10 papers a day, and it's very important to get clippings from 10 more even, because what I know is that the financial military center of this country is in Houston and in Washington, and there's information there that we're not getting, but which is affecting their behavior and what is going on worldwide. One article from the Houston Post on Roberto Calvi, this is June 20th, convicted Italian banker found hanged in London. And I mentioned that he was hanging off this bridge, that he was the chairman of the Banco Ambrosiano, the largest private bank in Italy, that he had been missing 8 days, and that he had $18,000 in his pocket. He had shaved his mustache. He had a passport to go to Italy. He had Brazil, rather. He had 1 foot off the ground. He was ready to go to Brazil. He was convicted of exporting $26.4 million in Italian currency out of the country, allegedly in Swiss banks. It's hiding there. And many of our agents are running to Switzerland to pick up hunks of money, such as Edwin Wilson, who picked up his $18 million in Switzerland. Now, the important thing about Calvi is that he was leaving the country because he had been prosecuted for this $26.4 million that was missing. But the Houston Post said this: Calvi's problems multiplied in May. That's while all these people were in Europe shuffling around, when the Banca d'Italia, the Italian state bank, asked his bank, the Ambrosiano, to account for $1.4 billion that has been missing since 1978. The bank's troubles were cited by the currency dealers as a key factor in the plunge of the Italian stock market and the Italian lira that fell to an all-time low. And as of last week, it was May the 18th, when all their activity was going on in Switzerland, a man named Bruno Tassandin, D-I-N, was arrested on his return from Switzerland to Italy for currency and stock fraud. Now, Calvi started his bank in 1945, that Banco Ambrosiano. That was set up by Hitler's Gestapo, by Dillon Reed, by the United States corporations, for an Italian dictatorship. They had funded Mussolini through his early career up till the end of the war. When the war was over, the American corporations poured this money into Italy and into an organization called Permindex, which was the overview, the assassination teams that had offices. They had missionaries in Mexico, Oaxaca, Mexico. as trained assassins under Albert Osborne. They killed heads of states all over the world. They worked with J. Edgar Hoover in Division 5 of the FBI. Permindex was set up in Italy after the war, and Calvi was involved in that. And what they did was they take money from various depositors and take it out and put it into the international fascista group, the Odessa, Hitler and Otto Skorzeny's network to have fascism in every country of the world. That's why so many people who begin to organize labor movements, to speak up for the rights of people, are killed. Newspaper people, judges, civil rights leaders, such as Medgar Evers, and Malcolm X wasn't the only one. Vernon Jordan was shot by this team, and this Franklin's now being held for that. He's part of this assassination team. And the 30 or 40 rock musicians that were able to get the anti-war movement going, who could get groups to, at Monterey Pop, a very popular attempt of people to get together and have a counterculture. Many of those people all had to be killed. The musicians, writers, newspaper people, judges, lawyers, anybody catching on to these death squads in many or most of the countries around the world are done in. And Calvi's scandal broke just at the time of the meetings in Europe when Ronald Reagan was in Europe. And it didn't involve just his $26.4 million. It involved $1.4 billion debt that was missing, and the stock market was crashing in Italy. And coincidentally, there was what they called a newspaper strike, so that the newspapers aren't running Italy right now at this time. Another article in the Washington Post, an important article, June 22nd, Italian banking rocked by scandals. And this goes with the disappearance of Roberto Calvi. When he was gone, they were afraid that he would be murdered or commit suicide or talk or escape and be somewhere. They didn't know which it would be. And we still don't have an account. Of course, we know what happened to him at that bridge in London. But with his disappearance, according to the Washington Post, it affected the future of all the banks in Italy, the $20 billion in assets. The Italian financial world in the last 2 weeks has been knocked and threatened. The future of Italy's private banks and out of Milan, and again, the stock market dropped, and the banks are under a terrible bind and scandal. So one man wasn't just found hanging off a bridge, and that was the end of his life. This Washington Post has an article, again, that the Rome Financial Weekly El Mondo speculated that the Ambrosiano crack in the bank that Roberto Calvi had could have been caused by the Vatican bank's refusal to honor the letters of guarantee of debts, that the Vatican was asked to cover for the failure of these particular banks of millions of dollars and then up to several billion, and they refused, and then Calvi was murdered. The Bank of Italy investigation into the Banco Ambrosiano, that is Roberto Calvi, tangled the affairs in Europe, and it's taken at least a year, and the investigators hope that the details of Calvi's movements in London before his death may provide some clues. So all of this is going on, and this group were directly linked to NATO and Alexander Haig and also the Central Intelligence Agency. And as I say, the Italian newspapers have been on strike so that a lot of people in Italy aren't getting this information. Another article that came out this last week has to do with John Paul II's visit with Archbishop Runcie at Canterbury in London. And it has to do with a split, the British trying to split the United States Church from Rome. But at the bottom of this particular article that I have, it was in New Solidarity, June 21st, it refers to Father Dulles, and it tells about the organizing of Father Dulles. Now, Father Dulles is Reverend Avery Dulles. He's the son of John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower, and his uncle Alan Dulles was in the OSS and formed the CIA and set up those Italian banking systems with the assassination teams all over the world as the director of the CIA. He's the fellow, Alan Dulles, that John Kennedy had fired because there was a hidden government behind his back and he didn't trust him. Well, Reverend Avery Dulles, who now lives in Boston, has now been linked, according to this article, to a group, a family that tried the second assassination on John Paul II in Portugal when he was visiting again in May this year. The Roman Church and the scandal of the Vatican are so tangled to the deaths and the attempted deaths and what Paul Marcinkus knows and what John Paul II knows, that they've tried a second time to kill the Pope, and that gets more complicated because the Pope survived this one also. But this Avery Dulles left Europe after World War II as a young priest with Martin Bormann and went down to South America, to Brazil and Argentina with Martin Bormann, the man who took the funds of I.G. Farben and Adolf Hitler to set up the Nazi network for World War III, the Fourth Reich. So one article this week mentions this Father Dulles. This is Reverend Avery Dulles, who's now in Boston, who's been connected to the group from Germany, from Munich, Germany, and Rome, who once more tried to kill the Pope. As long as they try and they're not successful, the scandal gets even tighter and more people have to follow their bases. And that is why there's so much pressure, I believe, on Alexander Haig at this time. Haig kept pretty cool through Watergate. He's been a military man. He's followed the U.S. Army intelligence orders. The first time he publicly panicked was when Ronald Reagan didn't die, when he grabbed the rostrum and said he was in charge. And from then on, he's had trouble because George Bush Factor wanted to be in charge. And many of the articles that I'll share with you next week about the fight of Haig and Bush stem back to the very first day that Reagan was president, and Haig wanted him to sign a paper that he was in charge of everything. Well, Bush wants to be president of the United States, and there was a long article in the Washington Post this last week that the argument with Haig had to be that Bush wants to be president. Haig wanted to be and couldn't win the primaries. Bush wanted to be and didn't get the nomination, and now they're fighting each other, but each one has his own problems. Haig has the problem of NATO, the Vatican, and the scandals of the would-be coups that didn't happen. Bush has Edwin Wilson and Navy intelligence when he was director of the CIA, and instead of cooperating any longer with each other, they're trying to cover their bases. So you can imagine how frantic they are. Now, Jack Anderson had two interesting articles this last week along these lines, and then again tying in the whole era of Edwin Wilson, because Edwin Wilson worked with all of these characters at different levels when Bush was director of the CIA, when Haig was active in the White House and military intelligence, and all of them can go back to Dallas, Texas, and to the murder of John Kennedy. There were two articles of Jack Anderson's on Edwin Wilson. One was last Tuesday, June 29th, a unique look at the CIA. And it tells about Edwin Wilson coming home and talking about how he smuggled weapons for Gaddafi while he was working for the CIA, how he infiltrated the Seafarers International Union that was set up. He was on the CIA payroll, how he worked with the AFL-CIO, which is completely controlled by our CIA, with bases in Nazi organizations. In mid-'60s, according to Edwin Wilson and Jack Anderson, Wilson was setting up a CIA proprietary, a consulting firm in Washington, D.C., which became that notorious Task Force 157 that I've talked about. Now, Jack Anderson said that when Wilson resigned from the CIA to go to Navy intelligence, he got a fee, again from our tax dollars, of $20,000. So he took that money from the CIA, this is a little retirement fee, and he bought himself, as a $25,000 bonus, he bought himself some property. And he put $60,000 down on a 500-acre farm. Then he got a 3,000-acre farm that developed to $5 million or more. Now, Task Force 157 was set up from Southeast Asia, from Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. It was the influx of heroin and cocaine from Southeast Asia. It was washed in Australia at the Nuganan Bank, and there are 16 major countries around the world that it linked up to Saudi Arabia, to Tokyo, to New York, and to our CIA, so that the CIA became the dope-dealing assassination team at the same time. They funded the Italian Christian Democratic Party. They killed Aldo Moro. Moro wanted to tax the Vatican's property. They killed Salvador Allende down in Chile. They were a continuation and extension of the Permindex organization. But now they could use the Southeast Asian conflict to rotate money and weapons and spread even to more countries. So Edwin Wilson parlayed his salary from the CIA into Navy intelligence so that for example, when he came home last week, he had $18 million from Zurich. He has a $5 million piece of property in Washington. And then Jack Anderson followed that article the next day, Renegades Ace in the Hole. And this is how Edwin Wilson would cause embarrassment if he had a public trial. And I tell you that Edwin Wilson will never have a public trial in the United States. And they give examples of how he served as Hubert Humphrey's aide in 1964. This maybe tell you the inroads of how Hubert Humphrey could pick up a touch of cancer and be neutralized as a political figure, such as Jack Ruby and Martha Mitchell and about 200 other cancers. And some evening, maybe I'll do just 1 hour on the cancer conspiracy and the political witnesses and important people that have died of these premature cancers. Well, he infiltrated the Seafarers Union, the AFL, the CIO, but he also had a very important role in the U-2 flight. He worked for the U-2 after the Korean War, the secret U-2 planes in California. He was in England, Germany, and Turkey. That's where the weather reconnaissance plane was supposed to have left from, that was down in the Soviet Union, that broke the peace talk between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Eisenhower said, don't fly the spy planes. I want to have a conversation, maybe some détente, maybe a little bit of peace. And so the CIA dropped the plane down. Now, Gary Powers said that he believed Lee Harvey Oswald had a role in downing it. Lee Harvey Oswald worked for Navy intelligence, as did Edwin Wilson. And George Bush and the gang, Lee Harvey Oswald, worked at a Minsk radio factory with a man from Argentina that the CIA was protecting, their family. And Lee Harvey Oswald's role in the Soviet Union, that I've said, for many, many years, my research led me right to Navy intelligence and the Nazi connections. And Oswald was trained at the Itsugi base in the U-2 stations and in the Philippines with the U-2 flights. He was knowledgeable of the whole Pacific radio communications. This is all documented by his superiors in the Navy. He started with David Ferry down at the Civil Air Patrol, as I said before. So again, Edwin Wilson not only works with Frank Turple and George Corcola and supplies Secret Service for the presidents and the assassination teams and the headquarters of assassins, but now he services as part of the U-2. The U-2 story is really the bottom line of who killed John Kennedy and the role of the Defense Department. So the ace in the hole of Edwin Wilson when he comes home is his role with the unions, with Hubert Humphrey, with the U-2 flight. Now, all he has to do is say U-2 and Washington trembles, because the one story they can't let out is the coup that happened in the United States. I could cite to you 77 countries that we changed governments, killed leaders, overthrew, destabilized. But November 22nd, 1963 was the United States. The attempt on Ronald Reagan in March of 1981 was the second attempt to murder the President of the United States in office. And the one with Richard Nixon didn't work. As Ehrlichman told you, they tried it. Now, I did want to do a lot on Bechtel, and I've got 8 more minutes on the Bechtel Corporation. And I do want to mention some important links of George Shultz to what is happening currently and why it is so important to keep Raymond Donovan in power. The special prosecutor last week said there's insufficient evidence to go after Donovan. The FBI links to Donovan, Washington Post article, June 27th. He's linked to the slain bag man, the man that was murdered, the mafia head, and links to Vito Genovese family. And that goes back to the Kennedy assassination. I mentioned that last week. Now, Mr. Clark, William Clark, the head of the National Security Council, hired Helene vonDamm. I mentioned this before. He was in U.S. Army counterintelligence. And William Clark has to keep the team in power that were involved in the Kennedy assassination. He came home from Europe in 1955 and has kept a tight finger on the Nazis and the Galen organization. And the woman who makes all appointments in the White House, Helene vonDamm, has been mentioned on shortwave radio in Moscow and on various broadcasts as insisting that Donovan be cleared. Now, why is it so important to keep Donovan in? The documents from investigating the Kennedy assassination have memos of members of the Warren Commission clearing Jack Ruby of any link of conspiracy. And I've read this on the air many times, the way the White House is clearing Donovan is the investigator has found no evidence. He's clear because they found no evidence. Yet when the Warren Commission was doing their work, this is what they would say. This was a memo, August the 14th, 1964, on the conspiracy of Jack Ruby and links to the assassins of John, and the assassins, not Lee Harvey Oswald, of John Kennedy. In writing their memos on the Warren report that they were writing, they said the preface and conclusion is that the commission found no evidence that anyone assisted Jack Ruby in shooting Oswald. Certainly it is true that there is insufficient evidence, and those are the words used on Donovan now, insufficient evidence to conclude any particular person assisted Ruby. Nevertheless, we have not conducted the investigation that would exhaust the possibilities that someone did assist and Jack Ruby in the shooting or in the assassination. So they said what we should do, being as Ruby's still alive and dickering for his fate, is say that we have insufficient evidence because they said in their own memos we haven't looked into the case. Now, it seems that Mr. Donovan from New Jersey is an important person. The state is very important into a lot of things that are going on at the current time. It's the home base of Warner Lambert, where Otto von Molschwing, the Nazi war criminal, based his headquarters. It is the base of I.G. Farben in the United States. It is the home base of a lot of the labor problems in the United States. And Donovan is too close to where the bodies are buried to have him fired. And the newspaper articles this week are very protective of Donovan. The president wants him in. The president has to have Donovan as Secretary of Labor as much as John Hinkley has to get off or Edwin Wilson won't be prosecuted. There are secrets that these people have that all connect to each other that would all go back to Dallas, or Jimmy Hoffa and his role in the Kennedy assassination of John or Robert Kennedy, or the murder of Marilyn Monroe the year before Kennedy was killed. The necessity to hold the line of these people must be terrible, the desperation. Can you visualize in Italy the banks with the missing millions and the billions? The Vatican is involved. The mafia is involved. The mafia is involved with Donovan and the Genoveses. Jack Ruby worked with the Genoveses. Going back 17 years of my research, these names are all surfacing, and the people that have to be let off the hook, such as John Hinkley Jr. or Edwin Wilson, go back, as I say, to the U-2 flight, to Houston, Texas, to the assassination teams there, so that what we're getting in Washington are a lot of excuses, a lot of cover-ups. You read the articles, but what we're not getting is a relationship of specific stories to events that happened in the past and that are affecting these people that are moving now. Now, Ronald Reagan is sitting in the White House. George Bush has won this struggle against Haig. George Bush wants to be president. He has the California team in there now. He has the power from the Hoover Institute, from the Bechtel Institution. They want to run the country as a business, and what's good for business is good for the country. John McCone of Bechtel McCone thinks it's fine to have Allende killed. George Shultz thinks that was great to kill Allende. He destabilized Chile. He didn't say that the American economy pulled their money out because they didn't want a socialist or Marxist government to function. George Shultz says the reason that communism is a failure is because it won't work economically. The reason it's a failure is that the Americans pull their money out, destabilize, kill the leaders, and say you couldn't make it work. Now, Shultz is the czar of Washington. He was the czar. He'll run more than the State Department. And if there is a let-up on some of the news next week, I'm going into the George Shultz connections. The Bechtel Corporation, incidentally, took over Dillon Reed, the large investment firm, last year, March 1981. And Dillon Reed handles the account of that diamond dealer, Harry Winston, the well-known diamond dealer. Now, that's the man that gave our dear First Lady Nancy $1 million worth of diamonds. So I'll leave you with this one. Did Nancy Reagan get $1 million worth of diamonds, in quotes, borrow, that we don't know where they are, and she has? And was that the way George Shultz got the appointment of Secretary of State? We know she likes diamonds. We know there was more involved in the Richard Allen story. It wasn't a $1,000 payoff. It was supposed to be more like $100,000 the day after the inauguration. The very firm that loans Nancy Reagan her $1 million worth of diamonds, the Dillon Reed, was taken over a year ago, and George Shultz, our new Secretary of State, is on the board of directors of Dillon Reed, who carries the account for Harry Winston, the diamond dealers. It keeps our First Lady as the Queen of the United States. Years ago, there used to be a scandal if a person working for General Eisenhower, who became President Eisenhower, had a vicuna coat. There were scandals of receiving gifts. But now we have our Secretary of State from Dillon Reed, on the board of directors of Dillon Reed, handling the account for the Harry Winston diamonds, and she's parading around the world and very anxious. She's worked hard with this guy. She's groomed him all these years. She has her diamonds. And so we have to get a man who has been part of raping the world, slave labor in Saudi Arabia, and I'll do more details on the conditions of working for these people. In the meantime, we'll take a break for 1 week. You read the news. I'll be back with you next week. And please remember, send money to Kazoo so that they can support programs such as World Watchers. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.
You've been listening to Mae Brussell on station KAZU in Pacific Grove. She'll be back next Monday at 7:30 with more commentary. Stay tuned for the blues.